Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we're going to review why cannabis brands fail before they start, an article written by Jared Mirsky of Wick and Mortar. On the line with us is Dan Kimmis, our CBD correspondent with Good CBD Products. Wick and Mortar asked 4 questions that they get asked fairly often, which led Jared Mirsky to write this piece in an effort to help shed some light on the branding process and why most cannabis brands fail before they even start. First question is, how important is consistency when it comes to branding? So successful branding, according to Wick and Mortar, is consistent branding. So would you continue to eat at a restaurant if it's under new management every time you go back? Probably not. So branding is important, even though right now a lot of people, consumers go in and they ask for the highest THC at the lowest price. That's leading them to the brands that fit their mold of what they expect, what they want, what they can afford. And so although I've made comments in the past that cannabis doesn't have branding yet, what they do have is names of companies that are affordable, that people understand, recognize, and appreciate, the value that they offer relative to the price. I still don't think that people go to brands because they like those brands. People do have favorites, but I think it's really more about what's the highest THC at the lowest price that they can afford.
Hey, Karan, a dirty little secret, right? One of the things that's interesting is you look at some of these brands that are trying, right, to build a national brand, and yet when you get on the ground, they're essentially licensing somebody else's grown cannabis in different regions, right? And so that lends itself to some very interesting quality assurance issues.
Right. I think one of the biggest points of consistency that we can point to in the regular market is probably Starbucks. I'm not a fan of Starbucks coffee, not just because of what they did to the Sonics, but their coffee has a consistent burnt flavor. And yet people all over the world go to Starbucks because of consistency. They would rather know that their coffee is consistently burnt than to not know what to expect. And so I get that. I've been to coffee shops and I ask them for Americano and they're like, "What is that?" I'm like, "Oh, it's coffee. It's your base ingredient, but apparently you're just a syrup selling company." So knowing what you're selling and having a brand that's consistent is incredibly important.
Full disclosure, Mirsky's one of my mentors. Okay. It's one of these things. That cat knows his stuff.
10 years in the game for Wick and Mortar, who just recently changed their own branding, as a branding company from Online Marijuana Design to Wick and Mortar. Has transitioned Jared, from 10 years working with cannabis to working outside of the cannabis industry, which is my 2019 motto, is to try and work with as many non-cannabis companies as possible. So now you're seeing Jared Mirsky of Wick and Mortar working with Gary Vee, working with athletes and actors, and really just trying to normalize and professionalize cannabis. And I think he's a great ambassador. So he has 3 ways to make brands memorable. His first point is that you need to invest in it. So to create a brand that you're proud of and will remember, you need to be willing to put time and money behind it. A lot of companies aren't putting time, and you see these kind of cartoonish type brands. It's not really memorable. So invest some money into it. The second one is hype up what makes your brand different. 46% of producers, growers, believe that their sole differentiator is that they have the best flower. And if that's what your brand is, then you're not really differentiating your brand. And then his third point is to put your story at the center. So having a cannabis story is important, whether that's from medicinal or a veteran or otherwise. It's an industry that contains a ton of passion, which is transformational in creating a memorable brand.
The number of times I've seen somebody say to me, or heard somebody say to me, essentially, well, X or Y wanted a lot of money for the logo. So look what, quote, I made, or look what my cousin made, or look, that kind of stuff, right? And again, what's funny is the discerning eye. A quote unquote normal human might look at your design and actually say, "Oh, that's okay. That looks okay." But people from the space, okay, they can look at a design and they can tell you things that you'd have never thought. And that's why you engage somebody like Mirsky. If you're going to go hunt the bread that is in the cannabis industry, are you really going to have your nephew do your logo? Really?
We're seeing the transition away from brands that have the pot leaf and that's called weed or whatever. Trying to mash up two words together with weed and cannabis or marijuana is just really stale, really boring, really old. And so companies are ditching the cannabis leaf, ditching the name canna and marijuana and weed and pot, and just creating normal names. And so we are seeing a lot of investment, but sometimes, money's just being thrown around and you still don't know what that company's brand is about. They're not differentiating themselves. And there isn't really a story behind it at all. Or on the flip side, it's all about the story and they're just a PR company, and there really isn't a brand. They're not selling anything. The third point that Jared Mirsky of Wick and Mortar brings up is, what is a typical branding process you take your clients through? If you walk out with a brand that has a drippy logo that looks like, an extract, or has weed leaf on it, or is a caricature that looks like you went to the state fair, you're probably not having a brand company take you through the entire process to speak what your brand is all about. So in the initial meeting, according to Jared Mirsky, there's a lot of listening that happens. So the first call that you really hear is the essence of the brand that a client is trying to create. But what they're also brutally honest when they have meetings during this phase, they think that the brand name or an existing website is simply not a usable foundation, and they will tell you that.
Good design has strong opinions. Good design is about listening. They listen and then they tell you how to take that story and communicate that through symbology, through essentially look and feel, right? And this is where, again, if you've ever been around a designer, they can come across as a little bit prickly at times. Mm-hmm. But that's because of all of the different stuff that they face where somebody's like, well, why should I give you X amount of money, again, when I can have my niece do this for me? And it's patently offensive if you're the designer, because, again, the things you've gone through to get to the point where you can actually inform on the topic, right? So, yeah, it is about listening. It really is.
They're in a difficult position because people want a brand that they don't necessarily know what that is going to look like in the end. So a perfect example is when I had the Seattle Super Chronic Cafe's logo made. A friend of mine is an art director, and he was asking a lot of questions that I hadn't even asked myself. And so sometimes you have this idea of what you want it to look like, but it's not really being conveyed through either the logo or the name. And so through that creative brief, that Jared Mirsky of Wick and Mortar brings to their clients, it's a long, drawn out process. And they're really trying to just draw out why it is that you're doing what you're doing. I was recently interviewed by the Spokesman Review for the Talking Hedge podcast, and it gave me an opportunity to really just kind of talk about why it is I'm doing what I'm doing. And that was really the first time I had planned it out. I didn't write a business plan. I didn't have a mission or vision statement. And a lot of companies don't. And when you don't have that process and you don't have that kind of self-reflective analytical process, Jared Mirsky is going to draw that out for you.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. So again, Mirsky's awesome. And then his team is, I believe the technical term is awesomer, right? They support him at a very high level. And the amount of knowledge behind figuring all of this out, right? And then again, contrasted by, I've literally dealt with people who have said things akin to, hey, we made the logo this last weekend, right? We did it ourselves, right? And stuff like that, where you're just like, okay, this is going to be, this is the foundation of your company. What are you doing? So it's very interesting.
And the final question is, how is branding cannabis companies different and the same as branding more mainstream companies in food or beverage? So this article goes in to say that there's a lot of unique challenges when it comes to branding cannabis, not the least of being the legal restrictions. So Wick and Mortar operates on a global scale, and they're dealing with federal regulations all the way down to local and provincial rules. So those rules can influence every piece of branding, from packaging to advertising opportunities, social media content, messaging, and more. And working with an agency like Wick and Mortar that's mindful of the unique challenges that come with cannabis branding is a benefit that's hard to quantify, but is another fundamental piece of their agency's success over the last 10 years.
I've worked with Wick and Mortar a variety of times. I've been with clients who've gone through the process, clients who couldn't take it, okay, clients who said, well, I'm going to have my, I'm going to go do this myself, right? Different areas have different rules. Okay. There are some places where your pot leaf won't actually be legal. Okay. And if you're planning on expanding into that area, you have a problem, right? There are other places where, here in Washington, they put this little, it's a very ugly yellow and green sticker on everything. Well, incorporating the idea that that's going to be there, or what do we do later when rule changes come? That's why you get a cool crew like Wick and Mortar. That's why you get Mirsky.
It's important to have somebody like Wick and Mortar on your back because they've had so many experiences with rules and regulations, like in Washington State, where the regulatory authority wanted to change rules on edibles that would have affected 70% of the market. And so if you're going to buy a package, with your brand on it, you want to make sure that it can test the time of the volatility. If rules change, you need to have your packaging design meet that long-term flexibility where it can continue to pivot and change. Right now, we're seeing some blunders in the market where packaging is literally turned around. So if you drop 50K on a marketing and branding expert like Jared Mirsky, and then you go to the store and you find that your logo and your brand is turned around so that the bud tender can read, the THC percentage, then all of that branding and cost has gone out the window. So you really need to understand how to lay everything out. And Jared can obviously help you with that. So it's important to not only have somebody who's an expert in branding, but cannabis branding. It's a lot cheaper to do it right the first time. That's for sure. So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out.